Hello everyone, it's finally here, part 2 of my updated Become a Digital Artist tutorial series. As I mentioned in part 1, I've learned that the hardest step when getting into digital art is when you have finally received your tablet, chosen the drawing program, and then you actually have to create something for the first time. I kept emphasizing how important it is to getting to know your digital tools, and that is exactly what this video is all about. Today I'll be giving you a pretty detailed and very beginner-friendly introduction to drawing digitally. But if you still haven't picked a tablet or an art program, I suggest you jump back and watch part 1 first. I'll put the link up here in the corner as well as in the description. And for this tutorial today I'll be using my preferred drawing program, Clip Studio Paint, but I'm going to be as versatile as possible so that you can apply the knowledge from this video to basically all art programs out there. I just had to pick some art programs, so I went with the one that I use the most. This video is not sponsored or anything, but it will be easier for you to follow along if you use the same or a similar program. I have an affiliate link to Clip Studio Paint in the description, but you can also just get a free trial to follow along with. And with all of that out of the way, allow me to introduce you to the world of digital drawing. What you see here is a typical drawing program interface. Even if you're also using Clip Studio Paint, your program will probably look different from mine, and that is due to what is called the workspace. Think of the workspace like your desk or your table at home. You might choose to have sticky notes on your table, your paper is there somewhere, maybe you have a palette or some pens, and maybe even just a lot of small objects that makes it all look messy. Your digital workspace is kind of the same. You have a palette over here, your tools are over here maybe, and a bunch of stuff you probably don't need. I'm going to reset my workspace to the default Clip Studio Paint workspace so that we can build our own from here. If this is the first time you open your program, just skip this step. However, if you need to revert your workspace to the default one, go to Window, Workspace, and choose Reset. All programs with workspaces probably has this option somewhere. Here is the Clip Studio Paint default workspace. Just as with your desk, you can clean up in here and move things around simply by dragging them. If you move these panels, as they're called, close to each other, you can also dock them together. As a beginner, I will suggest at least having these panels open: the color palette or the color wheel, your tool settings, and your layers panel. In Clip Studio Paint specifically, I will recommend the tool property panel, the subtool property panel, the color palette or the color wheel, as well as your layers. If there are panels you'd like to hide completely, you can usually drag them out and close them by clicking their X icon. Or you can access the panel's little menu and choose to close them. When you've created a workspace that you're happy with, you can save it as a custom workspace so that you can always reset it to this point. Go to Window, Workspace, and select Register Workspace. Depending on your program, the menus might be named a bit differently. Give your workspace a name and then save it. Now if you mess up your workspace at any point, you can go back and reload your current workspace. If you feel like you've seen some artists online using specific panels that you cannot find, chances are that they're currently hidden. Go to the Window tab, and here you should be able to see a list of all available panels. In Clip Studio Paint, the ones that are currently in your workspace have a little check mark next to them. The rest of them are currently hidden. Click on them if you want them to show up in your workspace. You can also at any point make changes to your custom workspace and update it by saving it under the same name. Now we're ready to add a piece of paper to our drawing table. Go to File and select New. This is usually where a lot of new digital artists encounter their first obstruction. What dimension should you use? What does the resolution mean? And in some cases you'll also have to choose between RGB or CMYK mode. The most common solution would be to pick a standard paper size. See this little drop down menu up here called Unit? Here you can change the units that you're measuring your paper in. Choose your preferred unit and type in how big you want your paper to be by having real paper sizes in mind. If you're from the US, you can start with an 11 by 8.5 inch paper. If you're from Europe, you can pick the A4 size, which in Clip Studio Paint you can find in this window menu out here. Set the resolution, also sometimes referred to as the DPI, at 300. This will ensure that you can also use your illustration for print later. If you're asked by a program to choose between RGB or CMYK, like you would in Photoshop, just pick RGB. You can always convert to CMYK later if you need it. RGB is the color space meant for screens, aka digital drawings. You only need to worry about CMYK once you're preparing your illustration for print. And I won't go more in detail with this in this video, just pick RGB, even if you plan to print your work later. Most art programs, if not all, have RGB as their default. Once you set up your paper size, you can save it as a preset. In Clip Studio Paint, you hit this little icon up here to save your setup. Name it something that reflects your setup, in this case 11 by 8.5 inches at 300 dpi, and then hit OK. Now the next time you want to create a new paper, you can find the preset in your preset menu. And ta-da! Congratulations! You just created your first canvas or paper, and we're finally ready to create some art. Let's now go over the essential digital art tools that you'll be using to draw digitally with. First of all, and maybe the most essential one, the brush tool. You'll find the brush tool in this vertical tool menu out here. Depending on your program, you might have one or several icons for your brush tool. In Clip Studio Paint specifically, you have several. That's because Clip Studio Paint comes with a lot of pre-made brushes that falls into the different categories. Click on each of them to reveal several brush options in each category. Now it's time to do a little testing. Pick several brushes and make some scribbles on your canvas. See how they feel, which ones appeals to you, what kind of texture do you like to draw with. And you can of course change the color of your brush using the color palette or the color wheel at any time. By the way, it's never too soon to save your drawing. Go to File and select Save or Save As. Make it a habit to save every few minutes when you draw. The keyboard shortcut for saving is Ctrl S, maybe Command S on the Mac, but I'm not sure. And I have just made it a habit to just click Ctrl S whenever I've made some kind of progress. If you look out in your property window for the tool that you're using, which is currently the brush, you can see that you can also change the size of your brush. You can also add what is called stabilization. In other programs, this might be called smoothing or correction. The higher this value is, the more the computer will help you creating smooth looking lines. I don't like smoothing when I'm sketching though, because the feature will also make your cursor move slower the higher the value is. However, it is super helpful for creating smooth line art, which I will come back to and show you later when I demonstrate a drawing workflow. Don't worry too much about the other brush settings yet, you're just getting started, so just being able to shift between different brushes and changing the size will be enough for now. The next essential tool would be the eraser, because you are bound to make mistakes along the way, unless you're a robot, which I highly doubt. The shortcut for the eraser is typically E. Either press E or pick the eraser from the tool menu. The eraser does exactly as you would expect. It erases stuff! Like with the brush, you can change the eraser size, and in Clip Studio Paint you are even offered a bunch of different erasers to choose from. Another tool you'll come to love is the Lasso tool. Go to the tool menu and look for this Lasso icon. The Lasso tool allows you to create a selection on your canvas. Say if you want to move the eyes, for instance, you don't have to erase and redraw them, you can simply move them. Use the Lasso tool to draw a selection around the objects that you want to move. Now either go to the tool menu and select the Move tool manually and drag your selection, or you can hold Control over the selection you made to temporarily activate the Move tool and drag on your selection to move it. Then remove your selection by using the shortcut Ctrl D for deselect, Or with the lasso tool active, click anywhere outside of your selection. Something I want to add to the lasso tool is a property called selection mode. Look in the lasso tool's property window and see these icons here next to selection mode. New selection, which is the default, means that when you create a second selection on your canvas, you will delete the old one. Add to selection means that your second selection will be added to the old one, meaning that you can have several selections or add to an existing one. Remove from selection is the exact opposite. It will remove areas from your existing selection. The last one, called select from selection, will simply select an area from inside your existing selection. I must admit I rarely ever use this one though. But here are some handy shortcuts for the lasso tool. Leave it on new selection, and whenever you want to add to your selection, hold down Shift on your keyboard when you select a new area. And likewise, if you want to remove parts of your selection, hold down the Alt key as you mark an area. The next essential tool is the Transform tool or the Transformation tool. The Transform tool allows you to scale, rotate, flip and distort your artwork. By default, when activating the Transform tool, either by this icon here or by the shortcut Ctrl-T, everything on your current layer gets affected. You can then make changes to your selection scale, rotation, size, etc. by using the control points along the edge of your selection. If you hold down your Shift key as you scale your selection, it will hold on to the aspect ratio. Move your cursor towards the corners of your selection to rotate it. Or you can hold the Control key as you manipulate a control point to distort your selection. You can also combine the Transform tool with the Lasso tool and only control a certain area, for instance the eyes. Use the Transform tool to fix your current drawing instead of having to redraw it. This is truly an example of the beauty of digital art. When you're done, hit Enter on your keyboard or the button that says OK to apply the changes. Now let's talk about layers, one of the other most mentioned obstacles for new digital artists. One of the reasons layers can be so hard to wrap your head around is due to the fact that it's pretty hard to translate to traditional art. The best way I can describe layers is that if you imagine traditionally drawing on transparent paper or sheets of plastic, you know, like those that your 90s teacher would use for overhead projectors in elementary school? Yeah, those. Whatever you draw on the top layer or the top transparent paper will always show up on top of your drawing. Whatever is drawn on the bottommost sheet or the bottom layer will be covered up by everything above it. In digital art, layers are most commonly used to structure a piece of artwork. The classic example would be that you have your line work as the top layer and your colors underneath. Now, for the sake of some simplicity, I have created one single color layer for all of my colors here. But you can divide your color layers into as many as you'd like. See what happens when I drag my color layer on top of my line work layer. Yep, as expected, the line art gets covered up by the layer above it. Now let's move the color layer back down below. Similarly, I can create a new layer on top and add stuff I want to go above my line art, such as highlights. You can double click your layers and give them custom names. And in most art programs, you can also create folders or groups for your layers. What makes digital layers completely different from transparent sheets of paper though, that I compared them to earlier, are the blending modes. Blending modes control how layers interact with each other. As a beginner, there are just two blending modes that I would recommend that you worry about first: the multiply and the screen. A layer set to multiply will darken everything below it, and the darker the color you use on that layer, the darker the shadows will be until they're completely black. Screen, on the other hand, lightens everything below it. The lighter the color you use, the closer to white you will get. Remember that a layer with a blending mode set to anything but normal will affect all layers below it. The last thing I will go over in regards to layers right now is something called a clipping mask. A clipping mask is actually just a regular layer, which then clips down to the layer below it. It simply means that the bottom or the base layer to the clipping mask defines the visible boundaries that the content on the clipping mask appears on. I know it sounds complicated, but here's a pretty simple example. On my base layer, I draw a circle. Then I create a new layer on top and make some random scribbles on it. Now turning my scribble layer into a clipping mask, which clips down to the base layer, will define the visible boundaries and limit them to the content on my base layer. Clipping masks can be very useful when you start applying shadows and lighting to your color layers, because they make sure that you don't paint in unwanted areas. Clipping masks are typically recognizable by either a little arrow, a color code, or some kind of indent that simply means that this is a clipping mask to this layer below. You can even stack clipping masks on top of each other, and they all still refer down to the same base layer in the bottom. I'll show you some more layer features once we get to the drawing workflow example in a few minutes. First, there are still two essential tools I'd like to show you. The color picker, also known as the eyedropper tool, is a tool that you can use to pick up any color on your canvas. This comes in handy when you start coloring and shading your artwork, because you won't have to remember what colors you've used previously, since you can just pick them up and use them directly from your artwork. And the last essential tool is the fill tool, also commonly known as the paint bucket tool. It's a tool that fills an entire area with any color that you have picked. The fill tool in Clip Studio Paint specifically is very powerful and offers you so much assistance in coloring. I made an entire video dedicated to this tool, so I would really recommend checking it out to get a very thorough introduction to using the fill tool. But in all its simplicity, it simply fills an area with a solid color. Alright, now that you've had an introduction to all the essential tools, I want to show you how and when you can use them. You can use this workflow kinda like a step-by-step process that you can use for yourself until you start developing your own personal workflow. So let's get started. Step number 1, the sketch. First, I'll create a new canvas and save my file right away. If you don't already have a blank layer in your layers panel, create one now. I'll just call mine sketch. Then I'll pick a brush that I like to use for sketching and start jotting down something. I usually start with a circle for the head and move on from there. I will use the Lasso tool and the transform tool to make corrections to my sketch as I progress. This isn't a drawing tutorial, so you are free to draw whatever you want, or you can copy my sketch if you want, I really don't mind. So far, I'm only using the brush tool, the eraser, the lasso tool and the transform tool, and as you can see, I'm just using one layer. Step number 2, line work. Now that I've created a sketch that I'm happy with, I'll move on to the line art. Sometimes, if my sketch is not too messy, I might not want to create clean and crisp line art, but instead I will just clean up my sketch and use that as my line art. To do so, I'll go to my layers panel and drag my sketch layer on top of the new layer button. This will create a copy of my layer, or I can just right click on my sketch layer and choose duplicate layer. Then I'll rename my layer to line art, hide the sketch layer by clicking the little eye icon out here, and start cleaning up using the brush and the eraser. In other cases where I want to create clean and crisp line art, I will instead go to my layers panel, select my sketch layer and then lower its opacity. Opacity is just another property that you can alter and apply to your layers, and by default they're all set to 100%, which means that they're fully visible. The closer this number gets to 0, the more transparent it will become. Now I'll create a new layer, call it line art, and find a brush that I want to use for lines. Today I'll pick the G Pen, Clip Studio Paint's version of just a very simple round brush. Now I'll draw the line art on my line art layer. Usually I add some stabilization or smoothing to my brush when I want nice and smooth line art. The cursor moves a bit slower when I do so, but that's just because Clip Studio Paint is working so hard on removing all the wobbliness from my lines. In Clip Studio Paint, I find that smoothing at around 25 is great for creating smooth line art. Step 3. Colors. Once the line art is in place, whether you created a new crisp line art or just cleaned up your sketch, we are now ready to add some colors. For colors, I like to divide my layers into areas that make sense for my current drawing. Usually I will have a color layer for the skin, hair, face, clothing, etc. Have as few or as many as you're comfortable with. The most straightforward way to color would be to simply select a color and using a hard round brush to fill in the different areas using your pen. If you're having trouble getting started with colors because you don't know which colors to choose, I suggest you take a trip to Google Images or Pinterest and find a palette that you want to try out. Once you've found your reference, you can open it in your drawing program and drag it out so that you can see it next to your drawing. Then you can use the color picker tool to borrow the colors from your reference. And if you watched my fill tool tutorial video, you'll learn that the fill tool in Clip Studio Paint can be asked to refer to the line art layer when you're using it, and hence you can easily fill in big areas of your drawing while being on a different layer than your line art and without the colors bleeding all over the place. Seriously, watch it if you'll be using Clip Studio Paint. If you want to add colors to your line art, you can create a clipping mask that clips down to your line art layer and fill in the colors here. Step number 4, shading. After the flat colors has been made, I will usually start to shade my character. Shading refers to the act of adding shadows and light, also known as forming values. For a beginner, I will suggest either of two ways to start shading. The first one being using layer blending modes. Create a new layer and place it on top of all your other layers. I'll name it Shadows. Set this layer to multiply. Now pick a color for your shadows. Depending on the environment your character is in, shadow colors will be different. Just whatever you do, do not pick the color gray. It will make your colors look muddy. Add a hint of color in there, and remember, the darker your shadow color is, the closer to black it becomes due to the way that a multiply layer works. To avoid painting outside of your character, you can go and pick this tool called Auto Selection, also known as the Magic Wand tool. Or you can use the Lasso tool to make a selection manually, it's up to you. Select the space outside your character with the Auto Selection tool and then invert your selection to end up with a selection of your entire character. Now you can draw on your shadow layer, and the selection makes sure that you don't paint outside your lines. And you can do the exact same thing for the highlight layer set to screen. The second way that you can shade your artwork, and this is the way that I usually do it, is by just manually picking the shading colors and add them on top of my base color layers. I can create a clipping mask layer and select my shadow and highlight colors and just paint them in. However, instead of using clipping masks, I use something called lock transparent pixels, which is the exact same thing as a clipping mask, except you do not have to create a new layer. You simply lock the pixels on your current layer so that you cannot draw outside of what already exists on that layer. And I do this simply to minimize the number of layers building up. This video is already long enough as it is, so I won't be going into details with blending and shading techniques. That'll have to wait for another time, I'm afraid, and you also have so much already to take in and learn from. So we'll move on to step number 5, exporting. Now that I'm happy with my illustration, it's time to export it so we can upload it on the interwebs. Simply go to File and select Save As. I like to use a high quality JPEG format, but you can also choose other file formats such as PNG. If you drew a character that you'd like to save without the background, go to your Layers panel and click the little eye next to your background color to hide it. The gray and white checkered background represents transparency. Now if you save your image as a PNG, you will keep that transparency. Additionally, I like to open up my newly saved JPEG or PNG and size it down. If my illustration is in a vertical format, I downsize it to approximately 1000 pixels wide. If my drawing is in a horizontal format, I downsize it to approximately 1500 pixels wide. Then I save them as a new file. These are the ones that I upload online, as I'm not so comfortable uploading full resolution artwork to the internet. They take up so much space and there's just a higher risk that someone might download and print your work. Whew, good job for hanging in there, guys. I know it's a lot to take in all at once, but you are now one step closer to become a skilled digital artist. I have loads of digital art tutorials and tips on my channel, everything from how to create lineless characters, painting hair, how to develop an art style, how to blend, well, you name it. I've shared my tutorial playlist in the description below if you want to check it out. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you liked it, which I'm assuming you did since you're still here, I'd really appreciate it if you gave my video a thumbs up, smash subscribe and hit the ding dong to get notified of my future tutorials and art videos. Until next time, guys, take care. Bye!